Hello.
Hey,
How's it going?
good. How are you? I'm
I'm doing well.
gonna invoke a virtual background. Oh, that doesn't work. Just kidding. Oh, this is kind of interesting to have a virtual background. All right, I won't bore people with that. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. How's your Tuesday?
It's pretty good. What do you have behind you? Is that it seems like some type of interesting artwork.
Oh, that's the Beatles Yellow Submarine. Yeah, that is a
That's
$20 bill.
is there a significance?
No, I don't know. I think we bought the frame and we needed to put something inside, so we just put a $20 bill inside.
um,
What it says about me, be the Beatles and money seem sort of diametrically opposed, but
well,
it's like
it is a $20 bill and not a $100 bill.
it's true. I think who's
Um,
who's on the bill? Do you know? Jackson? I don't know. Maybe that's not the best person to put on the wall.
Oh, we may need to reprint all the bills. Now, as exciting as it could be to really get deep into the Minesweeper game that is talking about everyday politics, we should try to avoid that. Just because there's so many other interesting things to talk about. Thanks for doing this. I mean, I'm saddened we don't get a chance to do this in the real world. We'll try to make the most of it in the digital world. I might interrupt you and you might interrupt me. And I think that's totally fine. We should just aim to have the most Aaron Sorkin kind of conversation that we can, just to make it interesting to anyone who's listening in. Overall format, what have you, is not particularly, prescriptive. This is not a, 60 minutes segment, but we'll just aim to try to find flow wherever we can. Does that sound good overall?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Super. So one question I've always wanted to ask you, since you've entered my kind of mental orbit, is, you started a company called Gumroad, and I was just wondering how does one come up with the name Gumroad? I mean, is there a particular road you were pasting your Trident gums on, or how'd that all come about?
Yeah, I needed a .com, and I would actually give my mom homework assignments when I go to school. This is like in high school or middle school or something, and I would so my characteristics were like the .com needs to be available. It needs to be 2 words. I find it's easier to sort of remember 2 words: Dropbox, GitHub, etc. Than like make up a new word. Also passes the radio test, where you can say it. You can hear it on the radio, and kind of know how to type it into your browser. And that was just one of the names that we had. Another one was Pixel Dig, which was like another company that I had back in the day that was just doing like web design. And then I built Gumroad, and I just needed a name for it. I built it with, I don't know what I used, but I needed to launch it. So I went to my GoDaddy, and it was available. It was like the only domain I had that was generic for this kind of thing. And so I just ended up picking it. I actually like made up an excuse. Like someone asked on Quora, like, where does the name come from? I think this is when I was really in the kind of like drinking the Kool-Aid and make myself sound really cool. So I made up like some reason that was like, a road that people like creators and consumers like discover creators, and gum is supposed to whatever, some bullshit like that. But it's just really a name. And I honestly sometimes don't even like think about the fact that it is called what it is called until someone reminds me. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's so weird. That is a weird name. I also grew up in Singapore, where gum is like a repeated feature.
I was going to try to work that in. That was the one thing they confiscated from me when I came in. I wasn't aware until I landed there, but no gum.
Yeah, the only way to get it, I think, is you have to go to the base, the U.S. Air Force base, and then they sell gum and Jolly Ranchers as well, and Krispy Kremes potentially too. Uh, yeah, it is like cigarettes in prison.
Yes. Yes. Maybe this was, maybe Freud would say the name of your company was a bit of an outlet to your upbringing, your alcoholism, so to speak. But I'm kind of curious. So do you think today, do founders, if you were kind of starting a business today, would you be as worried about the .com?
That's a good question. It definitely feels like I would say like a year or two ago, it would have mattered still. And I don't know what's happened in the last year or so, but it feels like I just see all of these weird names like the .so domain, the .co. Like I see a lot more of that. And I don't know if that's just like we've really truly exhausted like the .com namespace and now we're moving to, or like there's just the market is so frothy that it doesn't matter as much as it used to or something like. But it clearly, I don't think it matters nearly as much. .app. I guess the other thing that's happened is there are all these new TLDs, right? So you can now get like .app and .dev and some of these names that actually make the can fit into the product, which I think is good. And then of course there's sort of like the default like, answer people give, which is like people don't use websites anymore; they use apps and like domains don't matter. But I think that was true 5 to 10 years ago, and it was still like, or at least 5 years ago, it was still the .com mattered. I think what we'll see is companies start with these sort of like x.app or join this.com, and then they'll just buy the domain. You raise a Series A, and then you spend 100 grand or 200 grand on like the a one word.com. I do think it matters though. I think long term, like I would still consider if I could get like gum.com or something, like I would consider just rebranding the whole company, just because I do think like when you have stripe.com or square.com or something like that, it does add like a lot of credibility. People kind of just take you more seriously because it just implies that you spent money on something, right? A significant amount of capital. So it does matter.
And yeah, it's certainly interesting. I like your point about the instant credibility. It's like having a good piece of real estate on the internet. So you obviously addressed the aspects of Gumroad almost dying many times. One thing a variant of that I'm curious to ask you is, how did you handle that? Like, how did you find the energy to kind of push through when death seemed imminent?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was I just had to, like I think if it were a different kind of product, it would have been easier to just shut it off and like find something new or sell it or do all of the things that people do with their sort of zombie startups. But with Gumroad, we were still processing, I think two and a half or something $1 million a month at that point. So sending money to people, that they would spend on various things and it was just hard to like, I don't know, it just felt wrong to me that I would have to write an email to our users. I don't know how many there were at the time, 5,000, 10,000 people probably. And saying like, I want to start a new company or I want to sell a business or whatever. Like, sorry, you're not going to get your $6,000 a month anymore. Like it was just really hard for me to do that. Whereas like the alternative, and I actually did. I mean, I talked to a bunch of startups. I talked to like Stripe and Medium and Patreon and like all the kind of like usual suspects about potentially buying Gumroad for minimal amounts. I think we got one offer, which is like $1 million or something. I just didn't get nearly enough. Like it was just not interesting. We were like we were $16 million in preferences. Like we just wouldn't. There's no way to make the math work for the team or me or the investors. So really, the only sort of remaining option for me was like basically fire everybody and then turn it into a cash cow and just like let it run for as long as I need to like take a break and do other things. And then basically my thinking at the time was we'll see what happens. What happens if we get rid of everything? Sort of null hypothesis. Like let's just terminate everything we don't need. I would do support 4 hours a week every Friday. I would wake up and do support, and that was like my only thing that I would do. So like the average sort of response time for a support ticket became like 5-6 days, and it continued to grow. It grew 15%. Nothing crazy. 15% a year is like nothing in startup land, but 15%, then 25%. Last year we grew 40%. This year we're up 89% or almost 100%. Mostly due to COVID. So I think it was sort of like, if I came back and it really had kind of like plateaued and gone down, maybe I would have done something different. But I was like, I can just run this forever. It's almost completely automated. I even considered it at some point turning off signups and just letting the existing user base kind of, because that would be to me like basically every cost would go to zero. You wouldn't have to review any more accounts. You wouldn't have to do any more support because everyone would kind of be familiar with your product. And then basically up until like Stripe has some sort of like breaking API change in like 2043, I would be able to basically make enough money to live at least. And I guess to answer your point more directly, I think the way that I dealt with it was to say, look, like I have the thing that I thought I had, but at least I have all of this free time that a lot of people don't have. So I just started investing time into things. So I had, 20, 30, 40 hours a week that I was just writing, reading, obviously doing stuff that was like less productive too. But, I was certainly writing a lot. I wrote a science fantasy novel and then a science fiction novel. And I moved to Provo, Utah, and started learning how to drive and like snow, like just like a lot of things that I feel like I didn't do. I was like, oh, I now have the time to do that. And that's like a sort of a tried to kind of like turn it into a blessing. And then I spent a year and a half, 2 years. I learned how to paint, started oil painting every day, figure drawing. And then I wrote that Medium post about sort of after that, after I'd been doing that for a couple of years and I'd sort of like written it off. Like that post was really me saying like, I'm done. Like I've evaluated that situation. I've reflected on it. This is sort of like the capstone for that chapter in my life. And then it sort of like ironically kind of like opened up the door to it growing more. And like, maybe it's now going to be interesting again. I'm not really sure where it ends up going, but that's sort of like how I thought through that process.
That's interesting. And now you're in Utah, but you spent time in obviously both worlds. I imagine, of course, obviously you think Utah is the correct place to live for you. I'd be curious if you're kind of advising, say, an immigrant, from some random corner of the United States or the world. Would you tell them, COVID aside, let's imagine kind of all that comes back. Would you advise them to still come out to the Bay Area, or would you say no, come to Utah or a different place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I personally would advise them probably to come to San Francisco. It's my guess. Like, I think there's still, the way that I think about it is there's a fixed cost to moving to San Francisco, and there's sort of like potential unlimited upside to that decision. And I think until you have sort of like digital fidelity that's like almost like being in person, which even then I still don't know if it's enough, you're not going to beat the physical serendipity that you get in a place like San Francisco. It would be like trying to become an actor but not being willing to move to LA. It's certainly possible. Certainly there's very successful people in that industry that don't live in Hollywood, but it's it's like, why, like what, like you would have to have a really good answer to like, why are you not doing that? I think kind of like the credibility in .com, having the one word .com, like I think signaling, like moving to San Francisco signals to everybody that you're taking this opportunity very seriously. There's hundreds of thousands of companies being started every year, and there's maybe 1,000 of them or less being started in San Francisco every year. So just like it allows you to kind of like make yourself more compelling very, very easily. Like the rule that I had when I lived in SF was I'd meet anyone that emailed me for, I would grab coffee with at Cyclass on 7th Street in Soma every Saturday. And I would just stack Saturdays with meetings, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. If I had that many meetings. Typically I would not. And it was like to me, it's the best filter because you're effectively allowing anyone to do it. Like anyone, in my opinion, should be able to somehow make that work for them. But it is a filter, and it is a filter that alienates most people because most people are not willing to meet up on a Saturday or come to Soma or whatever. And so I think like just experiences like that, I think it is useful to like move to the place, just like going to college, right? Like it sort of signals to people that you're really serious about it, and it shows people that you're spending some amount of money and say there's some sacrifice happening here. We'll see. Long term, if it remains interesting, but my guess is it's still like there's too much mass there. There's too much density, and I don't see that gravity going away.
Makes sense. And I'm curious to ask. So obviously you'd mentioned like you hadn't had a driver's license and was very focused on your company and obviously saving it from perennial doom a couple of times. And so there's a thread of obsession in at least the one stage of your life, and seemingly once you realized you kind of could make the time, obviously you it seems like that obsession has spilled over into other things, painting, learning to drive, ski, whatever. Do you think that obsession is that single focus company obsession is a requirement for someone to succeed? Do you think it's something to look for, that you look for as you kind of now invest in companies, or is it something to avoid?
Yeah, it's I feel like I sort of speak out of both sides of my mouth on this one, because I think as an investor, I definitely want people to be single-minded and single focused on their company, and I typically like wouldn't invest in someone who is not doing that. Yeah, and part of that is it gets a little bit more complicated as you have sort of, you might have LPAs and like sort of fiduciary obligations to invest in people who have similar obligations, et cetera. But yeah, but personally, I don't know if that's like, I feel like it's sort of like it's important to invest in people who are a little bit stupid. Like if they're too smart, like they're not gonna, like they're not gonna solve the problem, because they're gonna realize, like if I knew how hard it was gonna be ahead of time, I would have just stayed at Pinterest. Like looking back financially, the best decision for me by far would be to just have stayed at Pinterest and built Pinterest for iPhone and Pinterest for iPad and done that for 5 years, and then had $100 million in Pinterest stock right now. But like, I don't know if that was the best decision for me long term, but it's sort of like when you see the struggle in front of you, like I think a lot of people get started because they don't realize it's going to be as hard and take as long as someone said, I still don't know if Gumroad is today. I think it's pretty nice. We're at 10 million in revenue and it's like a business, whatever. But like it took 9 years. I don't know if like the sort of the me of 9 years ago would have been okay with the outcome. Probably not, is my guess. Like if I said, hey, there's like a little crystal ball and it tells you this, if you work on Gumroad, this is where it's going to be.
Oh, that would be terrible. That would destroy all great outcomes too, by the way. I mean, I do think
exactly.
People that run $100 billion companies and they're like, yeah, this is abysmal. And it's hard. And on a good day, they're like, this is great. On a bad day, they'll tell you, if I knew. Yeah. So, there's
so I think you need that, like the sort of stupidity obsession, but it also fades. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that like Apple and Facebook and Microsoft and maybe even Stripe and some of these other companies fall into this bucket of like, I mean, like I would maybe even you're a good example of this, where like when you start seeing success, however you might measure that, it's hard. Like, would you start a company again and do it from the beginning? And it's like, I don't know if I could say yes to that answer to that question anymore. I think sometimes it has to be your first shot when you have everything to prove and nothing to lose, to really make it work. Because it's sort of like Batman and Dark Knight Returns or whatever that Rises, where you kind of burn the bridge and you really only have one way forward. But the minute you have, like, you probably see pitches from people, like sometimes some of the most appealing pitches from people that I get are like people who are insanely credentialed and like have started and sold multiple companies before. And it's always tempting to take the meeting. And sometimes I do. And I almost always will pass on them because I don't know. I just feel like they're not hungry anymore. I noticed this with like, obviously works, like Asana is a good example of someone who had $1 billion outcome and then has sort of like done it again. And Quora might be another one. But I think more likely than not, like, you're more likely to have the medium case, literally in this case, that like, it's just kind of, you don't have the urgency, like that sort of the urgency to make it work as soon as possible because you're scared of like, losing your reputation and stuff. So, what do you think about that? Like how important is that to you?
I do think obsession is important in a startup because it's an unstructured job. It's an opaque job. It's really not clear what to do next. And so in a clear job, it's always clear what to do next. And so I actually don't think you have to be that obsessed with it if you're in the infantry or if you work at if you work at Walmart. It's like very clear how to advance. And so there's a lot of motivational reward. You do X, you get Y back, you have your review every year, you're getting a slight raise every year. The issue with the startup is you really don't know. And so you are just like walking in random space for a while before you get any reward. And so as a result, I think you really need obsession to help you persevere. Otherwise, you will do what is extremely rational and just quit because there's no reward in the system that you're in. For me, I'm very envious of the people that achieve a sense of confidence and calm, you know, after a sale or whatever. I've never achieved that, and so, you know, I still have the insecurity, which I think very much drives me to try to make the organization successful. But yeah, it's definitely a mixed bag. I'm curious, on the topic of actually, you know, to quote Elon Musk, chewing glass and staring into the abyss. Kleiner Perkins infamously sold back, I believe, shares in your company for $1. And this isn't the hedge fund $1. This is an actual $1. How did you make that happen? How did that happen?
Yeah. So so I guess for a little bit of context, we raised an A in 2012 from them, $7 million A, and then we did a bridge from them in 2015. That was a 2 million bridge at 4x liquidation preference, and which was like really the only option we had left at the point. Otherwise, we would have had to fire everyone like 9 months before we ended up needing to, or what have you. And then I would, I basically in 2016, we tried making it work and raising a B. That failed. And then we laid everybody off, and I moved to Provo, Utah. And I said, hey, I'm leaving and learning how to write. Let me know if anyone has problems. I found a good tactic in my life is I just update people very frequently, so that when kind of foreshadow what's going to happen. So now when I do weird stuff, they're like, oh shit, I should have, maybe if I said something, maybe if they said something earlier, they would have pushed me not to do something. This is the great thing about investors who don't respond to your updates, is you can use it against them a little bit. Anyway, I just would update them randomly, every 3 or 4 months. I'd say this is, whatever. And then, one thing I did do, which might be related. Partly, Kleiner imploded, right? So I had a call with them, and I said, hey, we're thinking about open sourcing Gumroad. It might have started from an email that I said saying, hey, I want to kind of turn Gumroad into a WordPress kind of thing, where we have the .com and we have sort of an open source version, and that's lead gen, et cetera. And they were, and I was signaling to them that this is no business here. This is kind of a stupid thing to do if you want to make a bunch of money, and trying to get them to kind of maybe write it off. And they said pretty consistently, they were like, no, we own a percentage of this company, which is going to own that that IP, so we're not going to sort of revisit our position. And then 3 or 4 months later, they sent me emails.
They told you no. Interesting.
Yeah. And then 3 or 4 months later, this is 2017.
Wow. Okay. Fairly recently. And you're like, I want to make my company an open source project. And Kleiner says no.
Yeah. Or, not that they could actually do anything, but yeah, they were highly recommend not doing that. And Mike had left the board because he left Kleiner and he left the board. So there are a couple things I think at play here. So I was like, hey, what's happening? We don't have a board member. Do we need to appoint somebody, or what's going on here? And so I think that was part one, I think. And then a few months later, they just emailed me out of the blue, completely out of the blue, in November 17th or something, 2017, saying, we want to write off the position, but we want to buy back, sell you the stock back for $1. And I literally, I was like, what, I emailed, replied. I was just like, what's, what are the strings? Are there any strings attached? I don't understand why you would do this. And to this day, they haven't given me a reason. It might be Kleiner was just totally imploding and they just wanted to clean out the books, or they don't want to find a new board member for Mike, or tweeted it in support of Alan Powell one time. I don't know what actually led to them totally writing it off, especially because 3 months ago they weren't interested at all, because I suggested and they said no. And so yeah, they basically they were like, we want to do this, and I'm like, sure, I'm happy to buy. I mean, it's a great deal for me. I don't see why not. I'll do it. And then I sent an email out to my investors and said, hey, Kleiner just did this. Actually, I sent it out right before they did it. So just coincidentally, I think. But anyways, I sent out an email saying, hey, if anyone wants to write it off or discuss a buyback or something, I'm open to that, because it's making a little bit of money. We can buy a couple people out. And so we did that with a couple other investors. But we still have, 9 people or something on the cap table, $1.9 million on the cap table, something like that, which I assume will now stick around for life.
Look, even Mike Bloomberg only owns 88% of the empire. So, if you obviously have multiple identities, the identity of the leader of the organization, the identity of the investor. One thing I'm curious of is, again, if you're advising the young kind of founder kind of getting started in Silicon Valley, what is the correct strategy, especially as their company reaches some form of traction? And maybe we can think of two answers if they're different, kind of pre-market fit and post-market fit. What is the correct strategy for that founder with Twitter? Should they be, on Twitter, not on Twitter? How should they be thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is another similar one where I'm like, if I like to say, like, I don't want to invest in people who tweet as much as I do. So kind of similar thing. Like, I think it can be really great. And certainly I've seen it. I think Austin from Lambda School is sort of like become the perennial example of this. And he's really who I modeled my sort of quote unquote strategy off of. And I met him in Provo because he's from there or from Utah. And I asked him, I was like, why do you tweet? And he was like, look, I'm like, no one uses Twitter except journalists and like tech people. And he was like, yeah, but those are the people who kind of like set the dialogue, kind of set the zeitgeist for like a lot of other people. And I think he did it really well. And I think it's sort of a good example of like, you kind of like force yourself into first place in the zeitgeist, and then you hopefully kind of like succeed as well. I think it's a very risky decision because otherwise you end up with like a company that is hyped and then doesn't go anywhere, which is probably most of the companies that do that. I think he seemed to me to do it in a way that wasn't ego driven. It was like very much like, this is just like a strategy for building my company. It seemed to work for him. But in general, I would say founders should probably not focus too much on building an audience and like being on Twitter. Generally, I think ultimately, like, even if I think I would say, even in my case, like, I would hope to say some like insightful random things every once in a while, but like I think a lot of the reason people follow me is because I'm like open about the Gumroad numbers, and like I have this interesting story, and like people might have read it and empathize with it. But like if I'm just tweeting like from day zero of my company, like I have great tweets from back then that are like really detailed around whatever, but like I don't have very many followers, and I don't know how helpful it is. Like sometimes I get founders in my portfolio who are like, hey, how do I think about using Twitter? And I'm most of the time I'm just like, no one cares about you until you're successful. And then all of a sudden a lot of people will care, but by that point, like, it's never going to be a meaningful part of your business because you're already successful enough that, and so, yeah, I don't know. I would say like the long form writing works better personally. I think coming up with like this sort of first round review, like if you can come up with really good, like Superhuman, I think seems to have hit like a product market fit with that product market fit piece. Like I just see a reference all the time. And I think that can be really great. And also I think like if you see the people who are good at tweeting, it's typically investors. And I think it's because we need, like, at least the way I think about it is just like, I need to be top of mind for founders. Like I just need to remind people that I exist every once in a while, so that if and when people are raising money, like, and they're kind of making a list, I like show up in their head.
Well, it's interesting. And when you speak of young founders not issuing tweets, are you referring to consumption or just using Twitter, the app, entirely?
That's a good question. I would say mostly tweeting. I don't, ultimately I feel like everyone is wasting time on Twitter. I would like to say that I don't, but I do. And so I don't know. I do think it's not super useful, but I don't know. Maybe it is, like, maybe I forgot that maybe in the early days it was really useful to get insights from founders and CEOs. But I found that like in general, when you're building a company, like you kind of like over time you're just reacting to like the problems that are ahead of you and trying to get things out of your way. And like, at least when I read it, it's not like I see something and I'm like, I need to go. It's like reading the news, right? It's just like, you can read the news and you can be informed, but like, that's not really affecting your day to day. Like I'm not really changing anything I do based on what I read on Twitter or read in the New York Times or whatever. So I think that's ultimately founders should be spending most of their time focused on their company. And I do think it is a negative signal if you're thinking about raising more capital from investors, if you're thinking about hiring aggressively. I think a lot of people will look at it as a negative signal. They're just kind of assuming. It's weird because you might be wasting 3 hours on Twitter anyway, but at least you're not tweeting. Like for some reason, tweeting kind of signals to people that you're like wasting time or unfocused or what have you. Maybe it's just like being okay with disclosing that fact to people or something like that. But I don't know. I think ultimately it sort of ends up being a moot point. Like the successful companies, I think Patrick Carlson could have tweeted every day and probably would have been fine. And I'm sure he was on Twitter enough to do that. So it ends up being just like I think a relatively moot point. And then obviously for me, it's more about ego. Like, do you care about this? Like, because ultimately, I think people who are driven by that are very non-driven by the other things that are really important to building a large business. Like, I would much rather, if you find enough satisfaction from Twitter, you're not gonna need it from like building a huge business.
Yes.
You know, so I think that is for probably like the biggest risk is you get that satiation too quickly.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yes, it is a partial agonist in that sense as a drug, kind of hitting the same receptors, but not in the right ways. Let's imagine you're talking to a founder now who's fundraising, and they're trying to figure out kind of your classic question. Do I raise this round from a fund or from other angel investors? How do you reason about that with people? Obviously founders are often romanced by the brand of a firm. And so, that often comes up as a preference. How do you think about it?
Yeah. I mean, I always definitely biased, but I would recommend raising from founders and ex-founders typically. In generally, I think especially pre-seed, like the funds, their model just doesn't. They're not going to make money off you basically, and I don't think like I raised money our seed round. We had Excel in, and it was stupid. Like it was just like a waste of money. We could have given to somebody else. I do think like the utility of having a fund like that, especially 10 years ago, is one, they can write larger checks, right? So if you're putting together $1 million round today, you can kind of put a whole $1 million round together or $2 million round together just from founders and CEOs. I think 10 years ago that would have been a lot harder. And I also think the signaling has switched, where I feel like before I got Excel in, and then all of these other angels and stuff were like, oh, cool, yeah, like I'm in as well. They set the terms, blah blah blah. Whereas now you can kind of set your own terms. You can just do a rolling safe. And actually, the funds I feel like will typically like see a hot deal led by 2 or 3 or 4 different founder CEO type people, and then come in to do the rest of the round. That's kind of what I start seeing now. I don't know if I'm also a new investor, so I don't know how much of this behavior is like COVID related and just because everything's on Zoom and stuff. And so it's sort of just become a lot more social because you're texting people and all that kind of stuff. But my guess is that regardless, that's probably a permanent change. I don't foresee like fundraising kind of going back to the way it used to be. I think there is a lot of appeal though, right? Like ultimately, like when you talk to folks, especially outside of Silicon Valley, being able to name drop like Sequoia or Excel or Andreessen, it does really matter. But again, it's kind of like we were talking about before. Like it gives you the satisfaction a little bit too early. And personally, I think the ideal round is like 10 founder CEOs putting in $100,000 each or something like that, either from their own money or they have some capital they're managing for other folks. And then you can worry about getting the funds on board when you're doing a seed round or a Series A. Personally, I think that's like the best strategies to kind of keep them away as long as you can. And typically at an A, I mean, that's changing. Like, can you co-lead a Notions round, their Series A? Did you participate or no?
At some point, I invested in Notion. I think extremely late, but
yeah. So anyway, like that's now like I guess the solo capitalist whole thing is happening, and I think that's interesting. I do think VCs still have value to add at that level. Like if you're starting to think about company building, they like to call it, right? Like all of that stuff, then they can add more value. But generally in the beginning, like if you're pre-product market fit, especially, like I don't know what a VC is going to do besides remind you that you're not a product market fit yet and like send you competitors URLs every time they see them.
Yes, that makes sense. How many people are at Gumroad now?
We're around 20 people.
So I'm kind of curious so as a 20-person company, obviously you've kind of seen the whole scale. Right now, how do you kind of run your day at a 20-person company? What are the kind of some of the styles of meetings that you're having?
Yeah, we don't have any meetings at Gumroad. We got rid of all of them in 2017. Okay. Yeah, I just didn't want to do them, and we hired only contractors. We're still only contractors currently. So there's like 25 or so people, but everyone is just freelancing effectively for us. I just wake up and I check all of the mediums in which people send me messages, Slack, GitHub, and Notion, and then I respond to all of those things. And then typically I ship code on my own, like as an individual contributor. And the only thing, and then occasionally I do more quote unquote strategic things, like we might be doing a regulation crowdfunding round to raise a little bit more money. Or like,
Why would you be doing that as opposed to like normal venture?
Just to get our creators equity in the company, to kind of as a moat.
I see.
So we're gonna, yeah, we'll probably do a combo where we'll do like 5 million from reg crowdfunding, and then 5 million 506c reg D, like just from traditional venture. I think part of it is also just like the marketing around it. Like I want to, after having sort of like publicly sort of quote unquote denounced that, I don't want to like re-embrace it. And so I'm trying to like figure out the best messaging. But I think the number one strategic advantage of it is like there's so many people, the creator economy is super hot and sexy. And like I want to, if I can get 5 to 10,000 creators to all put in like $1,000, $2,000, like I think it would just make it a lot easier for us to remain relevant, and like sort of gives us a competitive advantage that's very difficult to replicate unless you also want to dilute your company. So yeah, that's kind of what I think about it. And then yeah, so really it's like just product, talking to customers occasionally, but mostly just like high level stuff. And hiring is the other big one. Is every like 6 months I'll do a hiring sprint, which is just me tweeting. This is one really nice thing about Twitter for me, is all of my hiring is now really easy.
How are you finding these contractors?
Just Twitter. I tweet? Yeah, I just tweet like, hey, I'm looking for, we're looking for an Android engineer, and I'll get on average around 300 to 400 applications for every.
And then how do you handle the screening process?
I just do it manually right now. I ask a bunch of questions in type form, and then I just filter them all. I filter around half, and then I send the other half coding challenge or some sort of 2 to 3 hour challenge, depending on their role. And then normally around 5 to 10 people make it through that. I screen them all on the phone. So that's definitely the most time intensive thing that I do. It's actually also the most similar to investing, where you're sort of big top of funnel, and then sort of like your value add there, I guess, is like on your ability to screen effectively and judge like the top, 1 or 2 people per round, and sort of quote unquote invest in them.
If you're starting a Gumroad style business today from scratch, earlier we kind of talked about how like unclear the feedback is with a company, and it's just like, until you're really successful, it's hard for it to be like, very positively rewarding. So if you were starting Gumroad today from scratch, how would you go about, like, what would be the first goal you would chase that it's set for yourself, and how would you go about accomplishing it?
Yeah, I think one mistake we made early was we didn't have, we had a product market fit in the case of like, we had a couple people find a lot of success. And I would have spent a lot more time making sure that it was replicable and scalable. There's sort of the meme around, do things that don't scale and all of that stuff. And I think that the issue with that, especially in the sort of creator economy, is sometimes, and I see this a lot, I'm sure you do too, like you see these startups that start up and they're like, hey, we have this amazing case study. This fitness instructor like moved to our platform and is now making $50,000 a month. And I think the sort of biggest assumption to prove right or wrong, for better or worse, is to figure out like how many of these people are there. Can you replicate this model? Like, can you do one of those a day? And I found, especially at least in my little segment of the economy, it's very, very difficult. Like the internet actually makes it very efficient to find those people. So in general, it's kind of like when you have a D2C product and you do Facebook ads and you're like, wow, LTV over CAC is insane. It's like, we can just scale this. And then 3 months later, you're losing money. Because you realize like you just hit the best people fast.
But going back to the question for a minute, if you were just getting started, how would you get your first? I don't even know what would be the right number of users to think about. Is it 1 creator, 2, 3, 10,000?
Yeah.
And then like how would you do that?
Yeah, I think between 1 and 100, probably something like that. And just cold emails, honestly. Like I think people still underrate like how effective they can be. If you have a product that you build that solves a problem and you email people one-on-one, it's super effective. I mean, I don't really do that today, I guess. I mean, as an investor, I guess I do, but yeah, it's totally like cold emails. That's sort of been the same. I think I assume people do cold DMs, or cold LinkedIn messages, or cold Instagram DMs, etc. But really, it's just finding those people, typically by browsing social media or YouTube or something like that, and then like figuring out what their contact information is using maybe Clearbit or something to do that.
How
And then
many of those do I need to send in order to get, say, 10 creators?
I would say it seems to be around, I guess, order of magnitude wise, 1% to 5%, maybe 10% conversion. So yeah, it was sort of 100 people, 100 emails to get a single customer typically seems to be like roughly the right metric. So a lot. And I think it also trains you to like, I wouldn't write a script and do it and like just like type the email every single time. Because I think it's sort of like you'll get a feedback loop of just like as you write and communicate what you're doing, you get better and better at figuring out like what works, what doesn't work, what gets responses, what doesn't get responses, or what questions people have that you can incorporate into the page. But I still think that's most effective because ultimately, like someone, I think this is why when companies like Notion and Figma and things break out and Slack, et cetera, like that bottoms up, I guess sales they call it, like it's I don't think people realize like how insane that is and how investable this company has become because it's so much better than like the way that most companies get built.
Yes.
And when you have a true self-serve model, it's just like incredible.
So okay, so it's interesting. Your kind of cocktail recipe here is, send 100 emails almost manually, which I thought was interesting, to kind of get one customer, and then do that 50 times. Is that right, roughly?
Yeah, and figure out if you can get it down, and that way you can also learn like, okay, these are the types of people who resonate. Oh, it's like I don't know, fitness people who use Instagram and have over 5,000 followers, and the last 20,000 or something, and then you can sort of do scale it. You can do content marketing, you could do I guess Facebook ads, etc. But I think ultimately, I think too many people skip the step of like doing it manually. Like they want to know what's the scalable marketing growthy way to do this. Uh, but those things take years, like SEO and all of these kinds of things take years and years and years to do and do well. Just because like Google won't give you enough juice until it's sort of a big part of the equation. So I think sales is a very effective channel. I think the mistakes sort of I made early was like Gumroad, like LTV is super low. And that's why I think that sales model, like eventually we don't have to do that anymore. We don't do that anymore, but it's very painful to do that and then realize like each successful conversion on that makes you like $5 when you're spending a whole day emailing to get that.
What are some this is totally shifting gears now. What are some interesting movies that you've watched that kind of inspired you in moments of hell at Gumroad?
That is a very different question. Really quickly on that last point, there are great databases to look into, like who represents and stuff, where you can find like who represents certain artists and stuff if you want to go that route as well. So you can find like who's Johnny Depp's agent or something and email them. And these people, their job is to just like check email and respond to email. So you can definitely get in front of
these professional communicators.
Yeah, exactly. Movies I've watched recently. Oh man. I don't what movie. I just watched The Godfather. I don't know if that was inspiring or not.
What do you feel like you learned from The Godfather?
Sorry?
What do you feel like you learned from watching The Godfather?
What did I learn from watching The Godfather? I realized like how many movies are like made by men for men. I've been watching movies with my wife, and like it's been interesting to realize like how many classics are just like a bunch of dudes with like one woman in the corner. I just watched what is it? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is also a phenomenal movie, but similar. That one was actually very, very kind of very inspiring. Where I mean, both of those movies, I think one thing they have in common is like they highlight the outsider, and like sort of like the idea that like who's insane and who's not insane is kind of just like determined by like whatever institution you decide to trust. And sort of insanity, it's like a very weird thing anyway. It's not binary. It's not like a thing that people are and people aren't. And I think Godfather's kind of similar, right? Where like you have these like mobs who are effectively like doing it because like no, the police won't. In this case, like one of the policemen is an antagonist. So like bodyguard for one of the other families or whatever. So I think it's interesting to think like in the context of, that Steve Jobs quote, like when you realize like the whole world is made by people no smarter than you are kind of thing. Like all the rules are made up, right? Like the things that are illegal and the things that are legal are just like words written down somewhere, if that, sort of Sapiens-esque. So I don't know if that's
What are other movies about insane people that you've watched that you've enjoyed, or that celebrate insanity more broadly?
Fight Club is probably a pretty canonical example that I think is great.
What aspects of Fight Club have you applied to your company?
What is a good one? I mean, having two personalities. I think being a caricature is an interesting one. Like, I remember Drew from Dropbox gave a talk somewhere, and he said like he sort of made an offhand comment that they should consider redesigning Dropbox or making it pink or something like that. And like the whole company just like pushed back a launch and redesigned the whole identity. And he didn't really realize up until that point like how much the CEO's words matter to people. It is almost like a cult in a way. Where I like if you see a ping pong table or a foosball table, like it's almost always like indicative of the founders or the CEO's preferences. It's like this weird thing, like that I've noticed, and I think realizing as a founder CEO like how powerful you are. Like I think the good CEOs don't really realize that because it's kind of like a weird thing to think of yourself.
If you kind of think of the ping pong table as a physical artifact that is a manifestation of the identity of the founding team, what is that in Zoom world?
Yeah, I would say what like the little $20 bill, I guess, in the background or something. But it's less obvious. But certainly, I mean, it's even just like what you wear. Like I think like fashion is like a big one that everyone, when they choose what clothes to wear in the morning, like they're picking. Now it's probably even more meaningful, like because it's like one of the few things about me is like the shirt that I'm wearing or something.
And the $20 bill you got.
I guess Zoom's like I've noted, certain people like really care about their Zoom setup. And it's sort of like interesting. Like some people have plants in the background and stuff.
That says about someone if they really care about the setup versus just kind of go with whatever.
I mean, I definitely would say I'm the kind of go with whatever type person, but
what does it say about you think? And what does it say about the opposite person?
I think it says that I have other priorities, or I believe that the message is more powerful than the medium or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe the corollary would be people who put a lot of time into it think that that's more important. But my guess is like those people are just insanely detail oriented and want to impress on every level. And it would be, I think if I were like a new person, like starting a company, like then I would be like, I need to take this more seriously. Like I need to show people that I'm serious. Whereas now I think I have enough credibility on other metrics that I can like avoid having to, signal that I'm worth listening to or whatever.
Very interesting.
I've noticed this actually with like Zoom usernames, where like some people are really trying to be like sort of inconspicuous, and then some people are sort of like very specifically trying to be conspicuous in terms of like if they highlight the company or not, if they have a last name or not, if they do all caps. I've noticed sometimes, and I don't really know what to think, but it's like I think people are trying to find ways to everyone's like projecting themselves, like this is how you want to perceive me, and I think we do that regardless if we want to or not, or what have you. So it's kind of interesting, even just like how much do you care about your company being next to you. I used to wear a Gumroad t-shirt everywhere I went all the time, and now I don't. I never wear a Gumroad t-shirt anymore, even though I have a couple. And so it's just like interesting, like signaling, I guess.
Fascinating. It's going to be kind of a final interview or podcast session question on my end, which is a bit of a meta inversion here. What are some of the best interview questions you ask people? It seems like you interview quite a bit. And then I'm going to ask you what your answer to those interview questions are. So just be prepared.
Okay. On the Gumroad side, I always ask people, what would they do if they were CEO? Like if you became CEO tomorrow, and like, what would you do? What would you build? Why would you build it? And the one thing that shows is also how well versed people are, because our roadmap is public, and like I tweet a lot about it. So like the more research someone does, like they should be able to answer. At least they should know what I would do. And there are people who would never, who just reiterate like what we would plan to do anyways, which is fine. But I try to find people who are like more willing to push back a little bit and be like, this thing that you decided not to do, like I actually think would be really worth it, and maybe here's some data that you might want to consider, et cetera. Like the way people argue, like the way people bring their ideas to bear, I think is really really interesting. And then on the investor side, I often ask, this is a very very common one, but like if this thing doesn't work, why didn't this work? I think most people don't think very deeply about the sort of risk factors of their business well enough. Like they think of the basic stuff, like we didn't ship, whatever. Like that's, but I think people who are really good at thinking about that. And then I asked, like, what have you learned? I think sort of startups are just like, you should be, your rate of learning should be, you're basically spending money all the time, and you want to be learning as fast as you can.
What have you learned?
What have I learned recently? Actually, I think you mentioned "Where's My Flying Car" when you were talking to Brett, and I recently just read that phenomenal book, and it was very very compelling to me, and I think I learned a lot about sort of like the history of aviation and nuclear power, and I learned that potentially, like, there's sort of like one thing that we don't really talk about. It's sort of like socially unacceptable to talk about, is like maybe the answer to climate change is actually just growing as fast as possible, and maybe we just get like better technology, and like technology has done a pretty good job in the past of solving a lot of problems that we thought were unsolvable, and then we just figured it out because we invented something we didn't know about before. And like his I guess like one thing that really stuck with me is like sort of if you take the sort of GDP growth that we're sort of willing to sacrifice, like that sort of becomes like something like a 60x, similar compound thing, right? Like you wait, like 2% a year, like that adds up pretty quickly. And like, would you be willing to be 60 times poorer but solve climate change? Or maybe if you'd be 60 times richer, we'd find different ways around it, and it would not be a problem at all. And I think maybe SpaceX or like Tesla or some of these other things might be examples of that. And so I think, I don't know, it was very compelling to me. I also just read a book called Ice Age, which is phenomenal. It talks about, the Earth is actually like incredibly warm right now, which is actually a good thing, because otherwise we'd all be buried under ice. And that's typically like that. The Earth is most of the time just a ball of ice. And this is kind of like a unique time. And so maybe, and it's not a case making the case that climate change is not true or anything. It states very specifically that the authors believe in human caused climate change. But I think like it just sort of gave me more like, it sort of like set the context a little bit more for me, and the sort of like how scientists actually look at the climate. It's much broader and more significant. And then like just like the politicized sort of like it's real and it's terrible, or it's not real at all. It was a very very interesting book. I love books because I feel like even if they're written 5 years ago, like they can't participate in the political discourse, so they have to kind of just like say what they think. You've already bought the book; they're not selling you anything anymore. They're not trying to get you mad and get retweets and all of these sorts of things. So yeah, those are two books that I read that are both really really great.
Humans are mortal, words are eternal. Well, that's great. That was actually going to be a question of mine. I'm glad we got a bonus answer to that. Look, this is awesome. It was great to hear a bit about the ups and downs of Gumroad, but I also think I always find like the color of the person is actually much more interesting. Maybe I think maybe to listeners too. Thanks for doing this with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Hopefully I was better than my tweets.
You were just fine. I'm sure your tweets are just fine too, but I like that sense of insecurity. I'm sure that still drives you as well.
It does.
Thank you again. I'll continue to see you and enjoy you on the internet.
Awesome. Sounds good. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.